eager to smile, chatty, and the man she'd married, a valet of African ancestry. They had wed under circumstances that the man had been unable to determine precisely, but which sounded extremely suspicious. After that success, Teresa had run into problems. Where the newly married couple had gone, nobody had been able to say. Maybe south, maybe north. But after the first night, when a Camilla Winters had taken rooms in a nearby inn, the man they'd hired had been unable to find hide nor hair of her in inn registries in all directions. The trail had disappeared. That was up until yesterday, when, by chance, Benedict had spotted a note in a newspaper about trading of all things. Contact Captain G. Hunter in his office by the Catherine Docks with regards to sale of good quality telegraph cable, or make inquiry with Mr. A. Hunter in Harville, Bristol County. Hunter was a common name. There was no reason that a valet should be associated with these Hunters, but it was something to do while they waited for their investigator to widen his search of inns. They'd scrambled to make an appointment. Here they were. The office they'd been directed to was small, the sort taken temporarily by traders who arrived in town for a few weeks in order to sell their wares. They waited in the hall, listening to two men argue, then laugh, then agree to terms. Captain G. Hunter was, by the sounds of it, an American. Well, Teresa supposed there were worse things in the world. The door opened. One man left. A woman ushered them in. The man who sat at the desk watched as they entered, then frowned at the two of them. He had brown, piercing eyes. His skin was a dark brown. His hair was short and curly. Teresa shoved her hands deeper into her muff. "Captain Grayson Hunter." He didn't stand. "You're Mr. and Mrs. Worth?" He sounded dubious. She would need all of her dignity for this. Teresa raised her chin. "I am Lady Teresa Worth. This is my younger brother, Benedict Worth." Captain Hunter's eyes touched on Teresa's hat, then her muff, as if sizing up her wealth. He glanced at Benedict's cuffs. Then he leaned back in his chair, one arm over the edge. Piercing eyes indeed. "You're here to answer my advertisement about telegraph cable?" His accent was definitely American. Benedict looked at Teresa. A clear sign that meant, "I'm bad at lying. You go ahead." Captain Hunter looked up at the ceiling in entreaty and shook his head before looking at the two of them. "I'm sorry. I know that actual adults look younger and younger to me every year, but are the two of you even of age?" Teresa's hands clenched together in her muff. "We're not children. I'm—"
"Old enough to sign a contract?"
"That's not my fault. I'm older than I appear."
"You must be all of 13 years old, then."
He was mocking her. Teresa felt her cheeks heat. "I'm 15, 2 months ago, and I don't wish to sign a contract. I wish to speak to you about one Adrian Hunter."
"Oh!"
He let out an amused huff.
"Has my brother offended you somehow?"
He leaned forward, and his voice seemed almost a mockery.
"Was it by existing?"
"I don't know if he's offended me," Teresa shot back. "He could have. That's why I'm here. Do you have any idea what he's been doing these last few weeks?" Something in her voice made him stop. He glanced to his side, at a stack of papers, and then pressed his lips together.
"And here I thought he was back at Harville, seeing to the china plates. Suppose you tell me,
His tone was mild. Too mild, really. Teresa stared at him in something like awe. He was even better than the Dowager, refusing to give away any information until he'd gotten it himself. "I don't know," she heard herself mutter. "We're just children. How could we know anything of importance?" He shrugged.
Don't mind me. I'm a bit prickly these days. England does that to me. And I don't dislike children. It's hardly your fault you were born a short time ago. Can you tell me something I don't know about my brother?"
She suspected he was still mocking her. She didn't care. She took a deep breath and bulled ahead. "I think your brother married my sister." He picked up a series of interlocked iron rings that sat on his desk and turned them over in his hands. He did not react to this, not for a moment, just turning them over and over.
You think. You think. Do you not know who your sister married?"
This was where matters became delicate. Teresa was trying to figure out how to explain the tangled knot of their family, wondering whether to start with the treason. In her experience, it never turned out well when she started with the treason, but no story ever made sense without it. Drat. "We lost her," Benedict said simply. Captain Hunter blew out his breath.
You lost your sister? That seems careless.
"Well, the fact that you haven't immediately denied the claim suggests that you lost your brother, too," Teresa shot back.
Point.
Captain Hunter looked up at the ceiling.
I told him so.
"Do you really trade ambergris?" Benedict asked, picking up a piece of paper off his desk. "Why ambergris? Why not tea or rum or cotton? Isn't that what traders into London normally trade?" "Benedict," Teresa grimaced. "This is no time to get excited by trade." Captain Hunter did not seem even slightly disturbed by this rapid change in subjects.
Yes, I trade ambergris, among other things. And no, I have not lost my brother. He has just been unusually evasive for the last month, and given what he was supposed to be doing, he would not want to admit to me if things went amiss. How he could imagine he would hide something like a marriage. In my defense, I spent 4 years fighting off privateers and blockading Charleston. I have to work hard not to order my family around. Apparently, I didn't work hard enough. But you don't want to hear my family history.
God, she wished she could do that. That insouciant look up at the ceiling, as if he didn't care about either of them. Teresa did her best to copy him. A convenient excuse to lose track of family. His lips twitched.
I was fighting for the freedom of millions. What was your excuse, little girl?
Benedict took an eager step forward. You fought privateers? You were in a blockade? What was that like? Oh, God, Benedict had latched on to the man. Teresa tried not to groan aloud. Captain Hunter glanced at Benedict.
Not as exciting as it sounds, unfortunately. The most fun I had the entire time was getting struck by lightning thrice, which tells you precisely how entertaining the endeavor was. Now, as to my brother.
You were struck by lightning, and you lived?
There's a trick to it, but
I want to be struck by lightning. For a moment, Captain Hunter seemed to be struggling with laughter. He set a hand over his face and shut his eyes before looking up.
I don't endorse it. Now, as to my brother.
What's the trick? Captain Hunter sighed.
Little boy, I'm an incredibly inconvenient case for your hero worship. Choose someone else, if you please. My brother, Adrian.
How does one become a person who fights privateers in the first place? I want to fight privateers. It sounds loads better than going into law. Captain Hunter turned to spear her brother with another gaze. When he spoke, his words seemed excessively dry.
You make laws that starve them of income. That's how you fight privateers. If you have to do it with guns, you've done it wrong. Stick with law.
Benedict subsided into confused rejection.
Every so often, some spoiled child decides he wants to learn about trading from me. His parents pay a vast sum of money for him to come along on a journey, and the only reason I ever allow it is the child inevitably gives up, because he doesn't want to actually do work. If I wanted to answer 1,000 irrelevant questions about what I do, I'd have an apprentice. Right now, I want to know about my brother.
And I want to find my sister, Teresa said. I have some information. You have more. If we pool what we both have, we'll achieve greater success, don't you think?
Captain Hunter considered her. That depends. How did you lose your sister?
There was nothing for it. She was going to have to start with... Drat. It all happened when my father committed treason, Teresa said. Our family was split apart. We haven't seen Camilla for more than 9 years. Our family fortunes have improved, and we are searching for her. We know she was married less than a month ago in Surrey, and we know where they aren't, which is Surrey. Plus, Benedict added, it's Judith's birthday coming up exceedingly soon, and we should hate to disappoint Judith. The man, to his credit, ignored the treason and the birthday, and asked an even more irrelevant question.
Who solemnized the marriage?
What?
Who solemnized the marriage? He asked. It's not so hard a question, is it?
Teresa fumbled for her book and withdrew her copy of the record. It was a Bishop Lassiter, witnessed by a Rector Miles and a Catherine Shackleton. Captain Hunter shut his eyes.
Fucking Denmore. Left him in the lurch once again. I told him.
He looked over at them.
Pardon my language. Small children. Ugh.
No pardon necessary, Teresa said brightly. I'm not that small. I've used that word before myself. Twice.
All of twice. My.
He didn't look impressed by her ability to flout social stricture.
Very well, then. Your information is useful. Trading seems fair. Bishop Denmore is our uncle on our mother's side. Adrian told me that he had hopes to bring Denmore around to recognizing our branch of the family. Denmore and Lassiter are at odds with each other. If Adrian has got himself in trouble with Lassiter, and if my gods-be-damned uncle didn't officiate at his own nephew's wedding, I know precisely what's happening. I was right, Adrian was wrong, and he's trying to work everything out, so he doesn't have to admit it.
Your pardon? Captain Hunter sighed.
I don't know where Adrian and your sister are at present, but I know where they will be.
Camilla had returned to Lackwich by means of Adrian's cart. Kitty sat next to her, clutching her valise and not speaking much. Adrian had glanced at the two of them with curiosity, but hadn't said anything, not until they'd gone to Mrs. Beasley's home and asked if they might use her front room for a moment. She had agreed, and then, with one look at Kitty's trembling hands, clucked her tongue and disappeared to fetch tea. Camilla had finally turned to Adrian. We didn't have much time, Camilla explained, as she handed the rectory's account book over. I haven't had a chance to truly look through it. I took this and his personal accounts. I verified that it was the proper dates, but I hope they're enough. Tell me they're enough." She felt her fists clench and tried to tamp down that horrible feeling that felt something like hope, something like betrayal. Deep down, she didn't hope it was enough. She hoped it wasn't. He took the book, looking at her, and then at the woman who stood 5 paces behind her, head down. Adrian's eyes narrowed. "Isn't she—" "You may remember Kitty," Camilla put in hastily, "from the time she perjuriously witnessed that we were legally wed. We found each other and spoke."
"I recall everything about that evening in vivid and excruciating detail."
Kitty winced and turned away. Camilla reached out and took her hand. "She also put the room key in my pocket," Camilla said. "And we have an affidavit from Mrs. Martin about the funds, right? I thought it could not hurt to have testimony from someone who would explain that she had an active role in the circumstances. Kitty will say that she had been coerced by threats to expose the truth of her 3-year-old child, born out of wedlock."
"Oh."
Adrian took a step forward. One of his hands drew up an inch, as if he was reaching out to touch Camilla, and then fell, slowly, as if he'd remembered not to do so.
"Well done, you."
His voice was warm with praise, and Camilla blushed, as if he had lifted that hand and run it along her lips. "Will it be enough, then?" Let it not be enough. She hushed that selfish desire and held on to her conscience with both hands, willing herself to do the right thing, the best thing. But oh, part of her wanted their quest to be hopeless, wanted him to look at her and say, "We've done all we can, let's try to make this marriage work." He flipped through the parish account book instead. She had thought he was handsome the moment she met him, but now that she knew his moods, now that she could read the intense concentration as he scanned down the pages, now her whole being swayed toward him, that firm set of his eyebrows, the press of his lips. Part of her wanted their quest to be hopeless. But it was no longer just conscience. There was another part of her, something that had always been there, a part of her that had yearned and wanted and desired, year after year. I want to be loved, not just picked as a default, not just accepted as fate. She wanted to be loved. She wanted him to devote that intense concentration to her, not because he had no choice, but because she'd earned it. I want to be loved. It was no longer enough to win for the sake of her conscience. Now, it felt almost imperative that she should prove it to herself, that he should care for her by choice, not by necessity. I want to be loved by him, Camilla thought. His finger halted on the page, tapping.
"Here," he said. "This is where the entry ought to have been. But there is very distinctly nothing in the parish accounts."
"That's good. But have you checked? Perhaps he recorded it earlier, or later."
"Did he often do so?"
Camilla shook her head. "I don't think so. But we can compare." The second book, the book of Rector Miles's private accounts, was taken out. There it was. £1,000 entered into the ledger. Income from investment, it read.
But Mrs. Martin gave £2,000.
Lassiter must have received half, somehow, but there's no record. At least not here.
Well then, He exhaled. We have them. Proof of wrongdoing. Mrs. Martin can prove she gave the rector money. We can prove they never sent that money onto the church or used it for its intended purpose. And Miss
Shackleton,
Kitty provided. Miss Shackleton, Adrian said, I must ask you, did Bishop Lassiter speak to you about this scheme? Did he threaten you?
No.
Oh. Adrian shut his eyes.
Is it enough?
Still, Adrian hesitated. Her mind raced through the possibilities. She'd read the reports after all.
It might be enough if all we needed was to prove facts for our annulment.
She knew how it worked, unfortunately.
It would be enough if facts were enough. There is motive, there is explanation, there are witnesses.
But, he gave her a sad smile.
But, she shut her eyes. But facts are what people believe them to be. And with nobody powerful on our side, the truth will not be enough. Your uncle—
My uncle, Adrian said, wants Bishop Lassiter. And all of this points to Miles alone.
You don't think your uncle will help anyway?
He looked over at her. I want to, he said slowly. I want to think he will lend his voice, but— She watched him. But, he said, I've known him too long. I suspect he won't.
Another silence fell. Camilla bit her lip and considered. She was technically Lady Camilla. Judith had no desire to see her, but maybe, if Camilla asked nicely— He must have corresponded, Camilla said. The bishop arrived on almost no notice.
If they did, it was not in my presence.
Camilla shut her eyes and thought about that morning again. She could see it, plain as day. She'd been harried, running around. They'd had no notice of the bishop's arrival, not until lunchtime. Her memory was good. She returned to it now, trying to recall any helpful detail. There had been someone at the door. Camilla had run through Rector Miles's office in haste. She had had so much to do and— Right. She could see the fireplace in his office, the grey ash that she'd had to clean out, mixed with little curling bits of paper. It had all gone in the dustbin. Damn. They must have corresponded, Camilla said, her nose twitching. But he burned the correspondence. After 18 months of cleaning, I know what a burned telegram looks like. Adrian lifted his head.
What sort of correspondence did you say it was?
A telegram. Several, I would imagine. He burned them. I had to clean out the fireplace. I would know. He was staring at her, his eyes broad and wide. Drat! Camilla squeezed her eyes shut. Drat, drat, drat! We're so close. There has to be something.
You said it was a telegram.
She turned to him. Why?
Oh, my God.
Adrian didn't stand. He didn't move an inch. Still, that broad smile took over his face.
There's still a chance, then.
And then, in his regular voice, he spoke.
Mrs. Beasley, he said, are you listening?
Chapter 19. It took Mrs. Beasley approximately 5 seconds after being hailed to appear, tea tray in both her hands. Well, dearies, she said brightly, who would like some tea? Camilla looked at Kitty, then back at Adrian. I've got some questions, I think, about a telegram that might or might not have been sent through your office. Oh, I heard you the whole time. Mrs. Beasley smiled and set the tea tray down. All the more reason to serve tea. She began pouring the brown liquid into cups. Never gossip on a dry throat. It doesn't turn out well.
So were telegrams sent between Lassiter and Miles?
Adrian cut in. Mrs. Beasley brandished the sugar tongs. 1 lump or 2?
1, but...
You know how I am, Mrs. Beasley said. Gossip only goes in, not out. I could never tell you what another person sent via telegram. That would violate a sacred trust reposed in me, and I'm not the sort to do that.
But then...
I would never speak of the telegrams I sent or received, Mrs. Beasley said, adding sugar diligently to a cup and handing it to Kitty. But I would love to tell you about the procedures of the telegraph office.
Ah.
Adrian nodded and took his own cup of tea. Camilla wondered what procedures she meant and how it would help, but Adrian seemed almost comfortable.
How long do you keep the telegrams that are sent?
He asked. I don't keep them. I send them on.
No, I mean, when someone fills out a form, or when you're taking notes on a telegram that comes for someone in the area. How long do you keep those notes?
Mrs. Beasley tilted her head and looked at Adrian. A little smile played over her face. Well, dearie, you know I'm supposed to burn them all at the end of every day.
But in reality...
Well, Mrs. Beasley shrugged. Every day is quite often, you know. In reality, I sometimes take a little longer. Camilla felt her heart thump. How much longer? Ah, a flicker of a smile passed over the woman's face. Well, it may have been a bit since my last burning. A week? 2 weeks? Oh, less than that, Mrs. Beasley said. 3 days. But how shall I say this? Operating a teletype machine is not interesting work, Miss Winters. Sometimes we keep things around for our own amusement. Do we? I could never show them to anyone, you understand, Mrs. Beasley said kindly. But they're all in the attic, organized by date. And speaking of the office, my husband has finished his time there, and he'll be expecting me to take my turn there for a few hours while he heads to the pub. Is that so? By way of an answer, Mrs. Beasley withdrew a keyring from her pocket. It is locked, the attic. But this... She fished one key out from the lot and jiggled it. That'll undo the attic door. I would never let these keys out of my sight. She set them on the table. Never. At least not on purpose. But I am oldish and forgetfulish. She smiled brilliantly. What a shame. I've misplaced them. Do let me know if you see them. Kitty offered to help, but the attic wasn't large, and in any event, Camilla knew what it was like to walk away from a place of employment with nothing but a valise.
Send your sister a telegram, Adrian told her, and tell us what you'd need. I'm sure we can find a position where you can have your daughter with you. If I can't think of something in my family's holdings, I'll find somewhere else.
It took Camilla and Adrian several hours to sort through the sheaves of paper in the attic. There had been hundreds of telegrams exchanged over the years. Few of them were relevant. They retreated downstairs with a stack of papers. Here, Camilla said. This one. What do you think? To Lassiter. Another package has arrived. Disposal in the usual manner. Adrian read it.
I have actually seen quite a few of those. And here's this. The date seems right. To Miles, package received. My thanks for another successful disposition.
A few more minutes found this. To Lassiter. An issue has arisen re prior package. Original owner is raising a fuss asking for package whereabouts. Advice is necessary. Cannot commit more to telegram. Camilla stopped. This is the day before you arrived.
It is.
This is it. I know it's not perfect, but this shows they were working together, yes? And that they had an agenda that they could not discuss in public.
I think it is enough, Adrian said slowly. Given the dates, Lassiter's arrival, the fact that they discussed Mrs. Martin in your presence, it might be enough.
Adrian tapped his finger against the page.
These are the last telegrams we have. But for this, it's the one sending for a special license. No surprise there.
Camilla took the form. It was hard to see her future written out in India ink like that. Lassiter had made the request, issuing the order with all the authority of his position. Need emergency special license. The details followed. To think so much had changed since the Wednesday weeks ago when this had all transpired. Except, Camilla pushed the page forward. Adrian, this telegram was sent on a Tuesday.
Yes?
Her voice shook. Look at the date. He requested a special license the day before we were put in the bedchamber together. He blinked, then looked up at her.
So he did. And that's our story. It all fits together now. Rector Miles receives his package, £2,000. He pockets half and shares the remainder with the bishop, who is helping him cover the crime.
Yes.
The bishop comes to consult on the matter. I start asking questions about the rector's household, and the two of them get wind of this and decide to discredit me. But Lassiter sends for a special license the day before their scheme goes into operation, and that pins the blame squarely on him.
Yes, Camilla agreed again. And then across the room, Kitty, who had been sitting and reading, said, No. They turned as one.
No?
Kitty smoothed her skirts and looked away. When the rector approached me, he said it was about Camilla, that she'd done something wrong and he couldn't prove it, so he needed to catch her in the act. The only thing he said about you, Mr. Hunter, was that you were nobody. Camilla felt a strange sensation, an almost dizziness. Me? But that had to be an excuse, of course. What would I?
You knew about Mrs. Martin, Adrian said. You're the one who told me.
She had, technically. She'd overheard it and remembered, even if they hadn't mentioned the words. But who would I have told? I don't know anyone. I'm nobody.
No, Adrian said. You're not.
Maybe not in the general sense of things, Camilla said, but to the rest of the world.
No, Adrian said, and Camilla felt her chest contract as she remembered. No, even then you're not. You're the daughter of the Earl of Linney.
She felt sick. And Bishop Lassiter asked me about my sister. But she doesn't want anything to do with me. I know she doesn't. Why would that matter?
Do you know that they want nothing to do with you?
Of course I do. Judith said. She said. She had said, years and years ago, and she hadn't written, and Camilla had taken all the hope she could not contain and pushed it into the future, hoping, 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 and never looking back. Adrian looked at her.
Do you know?
He asked once more. Yes, of course Camilla knew it. She knew it. Knew it the way she knew everything she had told herself over and over at night. Knew it the way she knew that it was likely hopeless to love. Knew it the way that she knew she'd do it anyway. She knew that nobody wanted her, that nobody remembered her, that nobody cared about her. She knew she'd hope for it forever. She knew it with a heart that had been bruised too often, with hopes that she'd held on to and lost too many times. She knew it with every fibre of her being. She just didn't know it with her head any longer. "No," she whispered. "I don't know." Her finger reached out and touched the dark letters asking for a special license, and pulled her hand away, feeling stung. "It makes a sort of sense," he said. "I should have considered it the moment you told me. They didn't know who I was. It wasn't me they were trying to discredit. It was you all along." "Oh, God," she inhaled. "Of course. It's all my fault. I should have known." "Camilla." His hand pressed against hers, warm and comforting. Her heart was beating fast and impossibly loud in her ears. "It was not your fault. It was never your fault. It was always theirs." She bowed her head. "And we won," he told her. "Look at this. They thought they could make you into nobody, and they couldn't. We're going to bring them to justice. You and I together." She inhaled. She didn't know what to think, what to say. Look forward, she thought. Don't look back. Don't look back. Don't look back. If she looked back, and they didn't want her, it would hurt too much, even for her. It was too much to comprehend. "Not me." She shut her eyes and turned her palm over so that their fingertips could glide against each other. His breath hissed out. "Us," she told him. "It has always been us." She was saying too much. She wasn't saying enough. "From the moment when you stopped me in the road and told me Miles and Lassiter were our enemies," she confessed. "From the moment I chose to believe you without proof." He leaned into her. "Camilla," he whispered. She held her breath, hoping. The heat of his body warmed hers. His arm, not quite around her waist, braced her in place. His breath whispered against her ear. But Kitty sat half a room away, and hope was all they could do. She tilted her head and looked up at him. He smiled at her. Oh, God, that smile! She could feel it break across her like sunlight. She had never felt so precious, so wanted. His hand twitched at his side, but it did not come up to brush her cheek. She felt it only in her imagination, the brush of his hand, like the caress of his gaze, stroking her. All the want she couldn't let herself feel rose up in her. All this time she'd hoped and hoped and hoped. Maybe it wasn't all the hope that had been the problem. Maybe it was that she had not let herself hope enough. Adrian's smile felt almost sad. "I could not have been more lucky in my choice of women to not be married to," he said. And maybe she could hope for more with him too. Her heart wasn't breaking. It was too full to break. She wanted him, and he wanted a choice, and she wanted to be chosen. It hurt. The best kind of pain, this holding back. But this prickle of hope, of sheer desire. It was nothing to the sea of loneliness and want she'd swum in for too long. To know that she might be loved, that she might be respected, to know that her family might want her. It was more than she'd had in years, and still, now that she gave free rein to her hope, she hoped for more. She had not come this far, holding on to all this hope for this long, just to give it up. She wanted him too. She wanted him to choose her freely. She wanted it all, and her entire being ached with the wanting. And so she just nodded. "It's the same for me," she whispered. "Not being lawfully wed to you has been a singular honor." Chapter 20. Weeks ago, standing in the road with the bad taste of the marriage still in his mouth, Adrian would have been delighted to know that this moment would come, that he would be sitting on a train with the woman he had been forcibly wed to, his satchel packed with affidavits and accounts. They were ready to annul the legal flim-flammery that bound them together. The only problem was that it was only the legal flim-flammery that bound them together. When they were finished, what then? Camilla sat looking out the window. She'd taken off her gloves, but held them still. She did not seem to notice that she was turning them around over and over again, as if she could direct all her nerves into the cloth. "Have you thought of trying to find your family afterward?" he finally asked. "I know you haven't wanted to speak of them, but they're still there." "I don't know." She blinked, looking at her gloves, then set them aside. "Nothing's changed. Judith didn't write to me, and maybe she's changed her mind. I suppose there's no reason to imagine she's tracked my whereabouts all these years. But if I go to her and she throws me out—" Camilla trailed off, shaking her head. "Would you like me to accompany you to visit them?" She turned to look at him for a long moment. A faint flush spread across her cheeks. He wondered what she was thinking. Then he wondered what he was thinking. Her sister was a marchioness. The woman he was thinking of as simply Camilla was the daughter of an earl. And yes, his mother had been the daughter of a duke. That only meant that he knew the set. He knew his own uncle, refusing to acknowledge his nephews, not even speaking his own sister's name in polite company, no matter how he professed his love in private. He'd met Camilla after she'd been out of that milieu for years. They'd been in his domain these last weeks. He hadn't forgotten the reality of the matter. He never let himself forget reality. But he was used to the notion of Camilla not having a family. Never mind. He looked away. I only just now realized how that would look. "I was just trying to imagine how I would introduce you," she told him. "Judith, this is Mr. Adrian Hunter. We used to be married."
"It does sound absurd."
"Now," Camilla said, "we are friends." He looked over at her. "That is what I would say," Camilla said. "Maybe I would add something like this. There are very few people I trust in the world. He is one of them." I do not know what she would say to that. Adrian looked over at her. He licked his lips.
"Cam, you do realize that I'm black?"
"I had noticed." She swallowed and looked at him. "I cannot pretend I know how my sister will react. I have not spoken with her once in the last 9 years. I do know that she—" Her voice faltered. "I know that the last time we talked, she told me that I'd made my choice, that I deserved to never be loved, if I was willing to give it up for the chance at pretty gowns."
"Camilla."
Camilla looked away. And you told me I deserved it. That I deserved to be chosen. That someone would love me for who I was. I do not know what my sister will say, but I won't stand for her telling me that you don't deserve love. She is clearly not an expert in who is deserving. Camilla shook her head. They were sitting so close, and yet so far away. The space between them seemed like a vast cavern. Her skirts were 8 inches from his shoes. Adrian leaned forward a little, and he didn't know if it was the movement of the train or the sway of her body, but she mirrored him, coming closer.
If we can't get an annulment, Cam.
He could see the smooth column of her throat contract. He wanted to give her freedom first.
I wouldn't impose on you, Cam. We could live separately. I wouldn't have expectations. It wouldn't be fair under the circumstances.
Her cheeks flushed even pinker. Her eyes dipped to the floor, but only for a second. Then she looked up, her eyes liquid. You could... Her voice trailed off. She bit her lip and inhaled. You could expect if you wanted.
Could I?
He leaned in another inch, lowered his voice.
What could I expect?
That flush painted her cheeks a dark red. Must I say it? I'd give you anything you wanted, Adrian. You would just have to want it. The more you wanted from me, the happier I would be. He could not help himself. He reached out and took hold of her hands. Her breath hissed out, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she ran one fingertip around the edge of his glove, brushing his wrist. Her eyes, when she looked at him, glowed like stars.
And if I already wanted?
He asked. She didn't say anything. Her fingers traced a circle around his wrist. She bent her head, just enough to press a kiss into his palm. He leaned forward, even further, reaching. Adrian, she said in a soft voice, shouldn't. If we're seen like this, you know what they'll say. We have one chance to obtain an annulment. We mustn't ruin it. Mustn't we? He didn't say that aloud, and she didn't let go of his hand. Instead, she shut her eyes, turned his hand over, and pressed a kiss to the top of his wrist.
Well,
he didn't pull away.
Let's talk about what our ruin should look like, when we know what our options are.
Let's talk about what our ruin should look like. Camilla could not get his words out of her mind, not as he brought her to a home on a side street near their destination, not after he introduced her to the housekeeper who had aired the sheets and removed the covers from the furniture in preparation for their arrival. A maid showed Camilla to her room. Let's talk about what our ruin should look like. She could still feel the warmth of his wrist against her fingertips, even though they were no longer touching. She washed and changed, then came down to find Adrian sitting before a plate of cold cheeses and meats.
"Make yourself at home," Adrian said. "The place is my mother's. I believe she inherited it from a great-aunt. It was leased for years, but the tenants went back to America, and we haven't found new ones yet."
Camilla nodded.
"There's no point delaying," Adrian said. "I'm going to bring our evidence to my uncle. I'm going to hold him to his promise, that he would help us with the annulment once I found evidence incriminating Lassiter."
She looked over at him. His eyes met hers.
"It's precisely as I said. Once we know that we can make a choice, we can decide what the choice will be. Annulment, or..."
There was an or He was considering an oar. Her heart beat too swiftly in her chest, and she could not contain her joy. But he didn't specify what that oar would be. He left to go speak to his uncle. She was left in the house, with nothing to do but wander the rooms and imagine the awe that might await. The space here had none of the warmth of his cottage back in Harville. There were fancy carpets underfoot, and elegant tables of stained mahogany. The plates were matched china. No amusing mistakes here. Her stomach knotted in nervous tension. She had never met Adrian's uncle. She couldn't even imagine what the room they would meet in would look like. For his sake, she wanted it to go well. And for hers. She wanted not the annulment, but him. She wanted to be chosen. She wanted someone to want her. She wanted... The sound of the front door opening interrupted her reverie. She almost dropped the book she'd unthinkingly taken from the library shelf. It took a moment to set it on the table with unsure hands. Another moment to take a deep breath. Her nerves mounted to a flutter in her belly. She reached for her composure and did her level best to walk to him, rather than run. She failed. She came to a skidding halt in the front room. A man stood there, handing off his coat and hat to the housekeeper with a, "Thanks, Genevieve." He was black, like Adrian. He was maybe a few inches taller than her not-really husband. His hair was in short curls. He wore spectacles. He was adjusting his cuffs as she came skittering into the room. He looked over at her. Camilla felt her heart hammering in her chest, nerves and tension reasserting themselves as she stopped short in front of him. He didn't seem surprised to see her, and the housekeeper seemed to recognize him too. He took a step closer. "Miss Camilla Worth, I take it." It had been years since she had been called by that name. It brought back memories, strange, tangled memories. Laughing with Judith, and trying on bracelets far beyond their ages. Judith saying, "If you don't want to be loved, we don't want to love you." Her breath stopped, then skipped, then stopped again. "Yes?" Her heart seemed to not function properly. Her head felt far too light. The corner of his mouth ticked up. "A pleasure to meet you," he said. "I'm Captain Grayson Hunter." Oh, for God's sake. Adrian's brother. Of course she had to meet him under these dreadful circumstances, when she was nervous and scared and full of hope. She struggled, and somehow found the power of speech. "Mr. Hunter," she managed, "how nice to meet you. I am—" No, what was she doing introducing herself? He already knew who she was. He'd said it. "Oh, that's right." He considered her. "I shouldn't have called you Worth, should I? It's Camilla Hunter now. Welcome to the family." He wasn't exactly asking a question. "No," she heard herself say. "Adrian has been most insistent on that point. If we are to get an annulment, we must not hold ourselves out as married." "Huh." He touched his fingers together. "How interesting. So, you're getting an annulment, then?" "It is generally considered the accepted practice when one is forced to marry at gunpoint." His eyes flashed, but all he said was, "Is it, then? I hadn't realized that gunpoint weddings were an accepted practice." "They're a rare enough occurrence that they are not usually covered in the etiquette books." Camilla's hands fluttered uselessly by her side. "Well, by all means.
amend the etiquette books.
He looked around.
Is my little brother around, by any chance?
He's gone, she gestured, her hand waving in the direction of the cathedral. To, speak. With his uncle. Your uncle, I mean. About the annulment and other things. Captain Hunter looked heavenward, as if beseeching some unknown power.
So, let me guess. Adrian found himself married at gunpoint. God, I have no idea how that happens to a man. And rather than tell his older brother about it, which would involve admitting that he was wrong, he asked Denmore for help. Denmore, of course, didn't give two sweeps of a broom about what had happened, and demanded some sort of quid pro quo. Have I got that right?
Camilla bit her lip.
That goddamned man. I told him so. But never mind. Here I am forgetting my manners, and this is in the etiquette books. I'm Adrian's brother, and captain of the pursuit. I was informed that my brother had wed, and suspected it was part and parcel of this entire mess, which meant he'd come back to Denmore eventually.
He must have heard about it from someone at Harville. No, not that. He'd called her Camilla Worth. But how did you know my real name?
Ah, his face cleared. As to that, I've something for you.
He reached into his pocket and withdrew a piece of paper.
Here.
He held it out. She took it. It was sealed with a bit of wax, stamped with the initials T.L.W. T.L.W. She had no idea who. The wax snapped under her trembling fingers. She unfolded the paper. Dear Camilla, the note read, this is your sister, Teresa. Teresa? Good God! She almost dropped the letter. She'd just allowed herself to hope that her family might receive her if she tried one last time. But she'd only considered Judith, no one else. The last time she had seen Teresa, she had been a little girl tracing her ABCs. Obviously, time had passed, but Camilla had no image of her youngest sister at all. We, and by we I mean Benedict and I, but also Judith and Christian. Christian is Judith's husband. You may remember him from the time he had our father convicted of treason, which is probably not the best introduction. And, bother, I've used too many dashes, and I have no idea where this sentence is going. Dash it all. A little punctuation humour to lighten the moment. Ha-ha. Camilla stared at the page. Oh dear. The first thing she had learned about her youngest sister in almost a decade was that she had a dreadful sense of humour. We have been looking for you. Judith misses you dreadfully. She wants nothing more than for you to come join us. Camilla felt her vision blurring. No, she couldn't cry. It mustn't mean what it said. It couldn't. The next paragraph was taken over by a different handwriting, the letters darker and less blocky. Benedict here. That sentence seems to imply that Teresa and I are indifferent. We are not indifferent. I have little memory of you, but I have heard stories. You would be a ripping great addition to the family, thank you. Teresa had apparently wrestled the paper back to add, you did grow up with Judith. And, quite frankly, we need someone to commiserate with us. She is an absolute tyrant, and I do not doubt you were right to stay away for so long. The handwriting for the next line changed once again. Teresa has no call to refer to anyone as a tyrant. The only hope the world has is that she is a girl, and girls are very rarely allowed to take over everything. Judith is not a tyrant. She is by far the least tyrannical of the two sisters I am acquainted with." The letter resumed in Teresa's handwriting. "Since I must be honest, Judith is a perfectly good sister who would be improved only by being a little less perfect. But also she favours Benedict over me, and I refuse to turn a blind eye to injustice. You have been gone so long that she will no doubt favour you above us both, which will finally put us younger ones on equal footing." Camilla felt overwhelmed in the best way possible. Benedict took over again. "Please do not listen to Teresa. She will give you an ill opinion of us all, and you should only have one of her." Back to Teresa's writing again. "We have become distracted from our mission, and I refuse to get distracted for longer than 5 minutes. It is Judith's birthday very, very soon, and we had hoped you might be willing to come for a visit. Our direction is—" Camilla read this all in absolute bafflement. The last she'd seen Benedict, he'd been a child. When he was a toddler, she had used to carry him around the house and call him her sweet boy. Teresa had been bossy even at 6, but Camilla knew very little of her. She'd gone to China with their father while she was practically an infant, and most of what Camilla remembered was her absence, and then her return. She had used to throw tantrums back then. Loud, angry ones that wouldn't stop until Anthony wrapped her up in his arms and held her so tightly she couldn't move. Teresa had liked that. Of course, Teresa had grown out of the tantrums. Children often did. It should have been impossible to imagine the friendly, familial bickering that the two engaged in, but she remembered it. Not from Teresa and Benedict. They'd been too young to bicker properly, but Judith and Anthony had done it, and reading it now, her heart ached. She read the letter again. She had no idea what Teresa and Benedict sounded like. The childish voices she could dimly recall no longer fit these two people who used words like tyrannical and injustice. But between the taunts, there was something there that made her yearn. It hurt to imagine being so comfortable in another person's presence that you could call them a tyrant to their face and not fear being tossed out. It hurt, and it felt good, and Camilla had been sent all over England. She had tried to make herself into half of what she could be, just so she'd have the barest chance of acceptance. And all the while, they'd stayed together. They loved each other, just as Judith had said they would. Camilla had given up this for gowns. She'd given up this. She read the letter a 3rd time. "Judith misses you dreadfully." How? How could Judith miss her? How could it be that anyone remembered her enough to miss her? And if she missed her, why hadn't she written? Camilla had spent her entire life hoping that one person would care for her. It was too much to discover that someone already did. She burst into tears. Her whole heart hurt in the best possible way. She didn't have room in her soul to understand how this could have happened, but it was here. "Oh, God," Captain Grayson said. "You're crying." He said it the way another man might have said, "Oh, God, I'm being eaten by wolves." "I'm sorry." Camilla sniffled and tried to hold back her tears. "I hate crying, and I cry so easily. I haven't seen my sisters in years. I thought they didn't want me. I could barely even let myself think of their existence. This is—" a gift, she wanted to say. But if she said those words, she'd start sobbing in earnest. It's been a while since I saw my siblings. I have no idea what they're doing. You can't imagine. The captain sighed.
I can imagine discovering that my brother was married because two hellions showed up in my office waving a duplicate from the General Register office.
Camilla sniffled. Very well. You win the competition. Have a biscuit.
You're right. That was an unnecessary comment. You're here in our family home. I should endeavor to be polite. Have a handkerchief.
He removed a square of beige linen from his pocket and held it out. She took it. I'm here, in your family home. I should be the one who endeavors to be polite.
That's true, he said. Well then, don't get tears on the family carpets. Those could stain, and I would have to throw you out to defend the family honor.
She looked up at him. There wasn't so much as a single telltale flicker of amusement on his face to suggest that he was joking. If he were Adrian, he'd have been smiling at that remark. Camilla blew her nose messily on the handkerchief he had given her, and then looked up. Oh dear, I hope that wasn't a family handkerchief.
Yes.
His voice was very dry.
It was. None hunters who use it perish.
She looked over at him. He held up his hands.
Adrian is going to kill me. I'm bad with tears and comforting. I don't even know if I'm supposed to comfort you. Why isn't Adrian here?
He's getting us our annulment.
You sound so excited.
He practically rolled his eyes. Camilla shook her head.
Oh, you don't want an annulment.
Want is a complicated word, Captain Hunter. Her voice was steady now. She folded the handkerchief and placed it on the side table. It's not that simple. What I want is to have not been forced into marriage at gunpoint in the first place.
Oh.
He considered this.
Shit.
He winced.
God damn it, pardon I mean...
Don't worry. The very crassness of the word emboldened her. She looked over at him and met his eyes. I am standing in excrement, and I want to not stand in excrement. We have an opportunity to clean the shit off our shoes. What we choose afterward is complicated, and what I want, I don't truly know. But you don't end up working with someone for a common goal for weeks on end without becoming friends. And when that person is Adrian... She trailed off.
Adrian is related to me,
Captain Hunter said matter-of-factly.
You don't need to tell me how attractive he is. We are similar in countenance, and I have a mirror.
Camilla glared at him. I'm beginning to think you are a terrible person. That brought out a smile, the first one she had seen.
Oh, absolutely. I am. I gather that when Adrian returns, the two of you will have much to discuss.
That was an understatement. Camilla's hands wrung together. Yes.
Well then, I won't complicate matters by waiting here with you. My questions are less urgent than the rest of your lives. I'll leave a note. When he has a chance, tell him I want to speak with him, will you? Don't tell him I said I told you so. He already knows.
Chapter 21. The papers were spread across Adrian's uncle's desk. Bishop Denmore nodded as he looked through them. Occasionally, he asked for explanation. Sometimes he shuffled back through them. Denmore waved one of the affidavits.
And could you get this Mrs. Martin to testify in person?
Adrian thought of the angry elderly lady.
I gather she would love nothing more.
Another pause, as his uncle once again reread the telegrams.
My God, this is extraordinary.
He looked up and smiled at Adrian.
This is truly extraordinary, Adrian. It's complete, and taken as a whole, it is utterly damning. You've done an amazing job.
Adrian could not help but feel a flutter of pride in his chest at that. He smiled shyly.
I knew I was right to believe in you, to leave this in your hands,
his uncle continued.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is wonderful. Lassiter will have to step down now. I'm glad to have helped.
Adrian was going to have to mention the annulment himself, he supposed.
I don't know how ever I will thank you for your assistance,
his uncle said.
Well,
he could not have found a better entry to the subject.
As it turns out, you may recall, a very good way to thank me already exists. You promised to assist me in the matter of the annulment of the marriage that was forced upon me in this matter.
His uncle looked down at the papers on his desk, not meeting Adrian's eyes, and Adrian's heart fell. Denmore smoothed the papers over, once and then again, before he spoke.
We mustn't rush into this.
Adrian wasn't sure who "we" was supposed to be, but his uncle gave a nod, as if he had just convinced himself.
That's precisely it. We mustn't rush ourselves. We must consider it very carefully, mustn't we? I was forced to join myself for life to a woman I barely knew,
Adrian said,
with a gun pointing at me. I personally feel that rushing is an appropriate response in such circumstances. Quite.
The bishop looked up.
My dear boy, that's an excellent point. If we had wanted to take action on this front, we should have done so immediately. Now, weeks later—
Adrian stared at him.
You're joking. You were the one who counselled me to wait. I would not call it counsel,
his uncle said thoughtfully.
Via telegram, more a suggestion. Think of what a mess this is. I couldn't support your bringing a claim. There would be public scrutiny. I should have to admit that you were a relation of mine, and how would that appear? My own nephew serving as valet to another bishop, to obtain information on his wrongdoing. That would make me seem underhanded.
That would be the truth, Adrian said, even more disturbed than before.
You told me to do it, and I didn't want to. If you knew it would be a barrier to your acknowledging me, why did— I didn't expect you to get caught. You told me to act as his valet. You obtained references. You told me to obtain information on his wrongdoing. All of this happened because you wanted it. You say you didn't expect me to get caught. But what did you think would happen when the entire world discovered that the man that Bishop Lassiter thought of as his one-time valet was actually your nephew?
Denmore stared unblinking in front of him for a few moments.
Oh, I hadn't thought that far ahead.
He hadn't, Adrian realized, thought of it at all. He hadn't imagined how any of this would take place. Maybe he might have vaguely intended to acknowledge Adrian, if he could figure out how to do so without consequence, but he had not given it any real consideration. Adrian just shook his head.
Of course it makes you look underhanded. That's because your behavior in this entire affair has been underhanded. That's technically the truth, but It's actually the truth. Not technically so. Well, perhaps. But how was I to know that you were going to insert yourself in the story in this manner? If you'd only— No, Adrian said, standing up. You will not pin the blame for this on me. You asked me to act in this manner. I had doubts. You directed me to continue the investigation after it had gone awry. Against my misgivings, because I believed you actually cared for my future, I went along with it. I did everything you asked. All I want is one thing, and you owe it to me. His uncle looked at him. Is she so terrible, then? The woman you've been married to? That's not the point. Adrian glared at him. Who is it? Her name is Camilla Worth. She's a lovely woman, and she doesn't deserve to be forced into marriage either. Well, his uncle brightened. To my mind, it sounds like you've managed to find a better woman than someone like you could expect. What are you complaining about again? Someone like you. Someone like you. Adrian hadn't wanted to believe it. Oh, that was stupidity. He had known it all his life. He had known it from the moment his uncle refused to acknowledge his own sister. He had known it from the moment he had been introduced as his uncle's page instead of his nephew. He had lied to himself, telling himself that if he was kind enough, if he was understanding enough, he would show his uncle the truth, that he and his mother deserved love, deserved recognition, deserved everything that Adrian had wanted to believe him capable of. All that time, all that effort, all that putting his heart into it, for this moment. Someone like you. He tried anyway, one last time. Please, he said, for the love you bear for me, for the love you bear for your sister, help me. Oh, Adrian. His uncle just smiled. Now that I hear what you've said, I really do believe this is all for the best. This can't come out in public. Lassiter will step down. Once I let him know what I know, we'll keep it all silent as it should be. And one day, when this is all blown over, one day, then I'll acknowledge you. There was no one day. There was only a string of todays, a string of empty promises. I have quite a lot to do with everything you've done for me, Denmore said. Do you think you could show yourself out? The wait for Adrian to return seemed almost interminable to Camilla. She didn't know what to do. She had a family, and they wanted her. If that were true, might it not be possible that Adrian could want her too? He'd implied as much. He'd looked at her as if she were precious. He'd told her that she deserved a choice of her own, that she deserved to be chosen, not just accepted. Was it so wrong that she was beginning to believe him? She had never known that joy felt almost the same as despair. Her heart was so full that it strained its boundaries, overflowing to the point that it might burst. Good that she was used to heartbreak. She suspected if he wanted her upon his return, she would break into pieces. Every sound that filtered into the room from the street below brought her to a height of dizzying fear, mixed with hope. Hope. Hope, the thing that had always ripped her heart in two. Hope, the thing she had held on to despite, perhaps because of, the pain. Hope that he would come back. Hope that Adrian would return and look at her and say, I wanted a choice.
Now I have one. I choose you. It was growing dark when she heard footsteps outside, determined footsteps, slowing before the door. It might not be him. Camilla's pulse picked up nonetheless. She made herself breathe, slowly, surely, as if she were awaiting news no more dire than what she would have for breakfast, or whether Parliament had decided to change some law on foreign importation that would no doubt one day affect the price of whiskey. She could not fool her body. Her heart raced faster and faster. The footsteps outside stopped. The door opened. She could imagine him in the hall below. The lamps were lit. In that golden splendor, his skin would glow. She could hear the muffled sound of his voice, addressing the housekeeper, his footsteps as he ascended the stair. Her hands clenched on the arms of her chair. His footsteps stopped outside the door of her bedchamber. There he was, rapping for entry. Yes? She managed not to sound nervous. Her whole chest burned, as if it were she being opened wide instead of the door. He stood in the doorway. She had no idea what he was thinking. She couldn't tell. Her own imagination was going so wild that he would have to tell her. Their eyes met. His, that dark, rich brown she had come to, what was the word? Ah, yes, love. She had come to love him. She had thought she loved him before, and every time she decided she did, she found new depths of emotion that made her see how shallowly she'd cared. She knew how sweet he could be, how gentle, how clever, how everything. It wouldn't break her to lose him, any more than any of her other losses had broken her. He'd helped her see that she was strong enough to withstand anything, even the loss of him. Still, she hoped that tonight she wouldn't need strength any longer.
Camilla.
His voice was a low whisper. Slowly, he shut the door behind him. That was intent in his voice. He came to stand in front of her. She ought to stand, but she wasn't sure her knees could bear her weight. Then he smiled at her, and her world broke into sunshine.
Will you be mine?
He asked. That painful ache in her chest squeezed more painfully. She was all too aware of her surroundings, of the creak of the floor as he shifted toward her, of the sound her breath made as it left her lips. She could feel her mouth cracking into the most absurd smile she had ever worn. All the hope she had been nurturing. She had carried it this far, and she had finally been rewarded. Yes! The word burst out of her. Yes! Yes! Yes, I will! His smile tilted. It felt almost tender. They had found each other, and they would belong to each other. He sat on the arm of the chair next to her, slid his arm around her.
Will you be mine now?
In every way. His lips touched hers. There was a sweetness to his kiss, one she hadn't expected. "Poor hound," she murmured against his lips.
Guilty.
He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer.
I bought a sack in town. I'm sorry it took me so long to return. I wanted to think things over, to be sure of what I wanted.
She was what he wanted. She realized it with a sense of wonder. She was who this brilliant, wonderful man desired.
I brought back most of it for you. I thought you might—
Like something to suck on, Camilla said sweetly. Why, yes. I suppose I would. He laughed and leaned to touch his forehead against hers.
My Camilla,
I'm going to make you happy, she told him. I want nothing more. He touched his fingers to her cheek.
I have every hope you'll succeed.
And then he kissed her. His lips were soft and gentle, and the touch of his hand, grounding her in place, made all those years of misery seem almost worth it. He had chosen her. He had chosen her. They were married in name. They would be married in truth when they were finished. He pulled her close, close enough that she could feel the strength in his arms, the planes of his chest.
God,
he said,
I've been wanting to do this for so long.
Another kiss, this one long and lingering. He tasted sweet, like her future, and she could see it spread before them. She would take to being his wife with alacrity. She would introduce him to her family, and stand by him if they were rude. She would learn her duties and do whatever was required. She would have his children, and make jokes with his brother, and have a life filled with sunshine and joy. She could hardly bear to believe that she had somehow earned this joy. His hands slid to her ribs, and slowly he stood. She stood with him. It felt natural to touch him like this, natural for their bodies to wind around each other. He pulled her to the bed. They sank down against the covers together. His weight was solid on top of her, solid and real and here, and, oh God, she still wasn't prepared. She'd bolstered herself for heartbreak, but she'd wanted this. She'd wanted it so much. He had chosen her. He had actually chosen her. I am going to make you so happy, she whispered again. It was a promise. It was more. She had so much joy in her now that she could not possibly keep it all to herself. His mouth levered hers open. He tasted of something that was dark and caramelly. She opened to him, and to the unbearable sweetness of the moment.
Camilla, sweetheart.
He slid to the side. She almost protested the loss of him, but he didn't take his hands off her. Instead, he undid her sash. Camilla worked the laces of her gown until they were loosened and the whole thing could come off. His eyes lingered on her ankle. His gaze shifted up.
You lovely woman,
he breathed. He took off his own coat and laid it next to her gown. He undid her corset. She fumbled with the buttons of his shirt. Every so often, their eyes would meet, and their fingers would slip. She would stroke his satiny skin, or his knuckles would brush the tip of her nipple through her corset. She was on fire for him when he got her down to her shift, when he had on nothing but trousers, and a bulge in them too. He stood and undid the buttons slowly, stripping his trousers away to reveal lean hips meeting a sculpted stomach in a perfect cursive V. At the apex, she slid her hand along that perfect line between thigh and torso, following it from hip to majestic point. God, he was perfect there, too. Dark skin, edging darker still at the tip of his penis, erect and so lovely. He let her play her hand along the length of him, exploring the entirety of the organ that would enter her from root to end. Her body clenched in liquid anticipation. She looked up at him. He knelt on the bed below her. Adrian. He set his hands on the hem of her shift.
Camilla.
Please. He took her shift off. For a moment, they looked at each other. The air was cold against her skin. Her nipples pebbled in response. Then, ever so slowly, he set his hands on her knees and slid them apart. He inched forward and set his mouth. God, she'd imagined that sort of a kiss before in her wickedest dreams, and had been shocked at herself even then. Reality was even more delightfully shocking. His tongue swirled against her thigh, then up, until the tip slid inside her. She let out a little gasp. He glanced up at her with a smile that could not have been more self-assured, as if he knew exactly what sort of pleasure shot through her at that lick, and the next one. His hand came up. His mouth shifted, clasping onto a point higher, and Camilla let out a squeak.
Sweetheart, it does get even better.
She nodded. Of course it does. He set his lips back against hers, and it got even better, lick by lick, swirl by swirl, until she shut her eyes and saw a spiraling pattern against her vision. Her fists clasped against the bedsheets, squeezing. Her thighs clamped around his shoulders.
There.
Yes. She felt breathless, even though she was scarcely moving. So little. Just the shift of her hips in time to the thrust of his tongue. She was on the verge of something powerful, something bigger than she'd ever experienced. She was on the verge of Adrian pulling away. Cool air touched her thighs. She looked up at him, and for 1 second, dark doubts assailed her. No, he didn't really want her. He'd done this to prove he could have her. He meant to leave her here and no. No. She stopped before her fear of the past caught up with her. Adrian could never be cruel. Her doubts were unworthy of him. She let herself frown a little. You stopped. A little smile touched his lips.
I didn't realize you'd warm so easily. And there's much I haven't done to you yet.
Do it all. He set his hands on her hips and came up off his knees until he was over her.
Don't you worry, my Lady Camilla. I will.
His fingers whispered up her sides. He leaned down, and his mouth caught her nipple. She made a choking sound.
Ah, you like that.
He licked around her areola, then gave her a determined suck. Her eyes fluttered shut again. She'd been on the brink of desperation when he'd stopped before. He drove her back to that brink now, desperate and needing, wanting him, wanting all of him. And then she had it. A pressure, welcome, at this point needed, between her thighs. Pushing. Her body opened to him. He entered her slowly, masterfully. She felt herself stretching around him. She needed him so much. He wasn't holding back any longer. It was too late for an annulment now. It was too late to say no, and she never wanted to do it. Now they were one. He let out a sigh. She opened her eyes again to see him watching her tenderly, perfectly. He had chosen her. She would never stop grinning. He had chosen this, between them and nobody else, forever and ever, for the rest of their days. She gave everything up to him. He moved inside her. There was a delicious feel where they joined. She could drown in the sensation of his hands moving on her, of her body accepting his, over and over. The sound of their bodies made delightful music. His mouth found hers once more. The sweetness she'd tasted before mixed with her own musk. His kiss lingered and possessed. His thrusts turned harder, faster. He claimed her all over, and she gave herself up to him, all of her. She let go all at once, in a spill of perfection. She felt her body squeezing, catching fire. And he did too. She could feel the heat of him. His hands clenched into her hips. He let out a noise, a perfect little growl as he came. "Adrian!" She ran her fingers along his brow. It was damp with exertion. She looked up at him. "Adrian, sweetheart."
"Camilla."
His eyes met hers.
Oh, God, I have wanted to do that for an age.
And now we can. They lay in each other's arms. His hand stroked down her hair. It felt almost like perfection. It took a moment to remember. "Your brother came by." He shut his eyes.
Oh, God. Grayson. He is going to be an absolute wretch. I have no idea what to tell him.
"He had, of all things, a letter from my sister and brother. They—" She smiled shyly. "They asked us to visit. And—" It occurred to her suddenly, and another jolt of happiness raced through her. "They've met Grayson, and they want us to visit."
That's lovely.
He stroked his hand down the side of her face. A flicker of a smile touched his lips again.
Family is lovely. Even if Grayson is a wretch.
She smiled back. "So, do I get to meet this uncle of yours while we're here?" He tensed beside her.
Camilla.
Just that one word, and the doubts she had thought banished rose to the surface of her consciousness, like goldfish rising in a pond to be fed. She was imagining things. She was so used to unhappiness that she could not let herself believe. But no, she wasn't imagining it. Adrian had pulled away. Just an inch, but it was there between them. "Do you not want me to meet your family?" He sat, put his hands over his eyes.
Family.
The words sounded so bitter. How could he be so bitter about a word like that at a time like this?
I won't call him that any more. I asked him for one thing. One thing. And I was fed that astonishing pack of self-serving lies.
Camilla felt her whole body go cold. "What happened?" He looked up at the ceiling.
It's too late, he said. We waited too long. If his colleagues find out that his own nephew posed as a valet, it will make him seem underhanded. He can't stick his neck out for me. No, not even after all that I've done. And I should be happy that you are not a complete wretch.
Oh, it was all she could think at first. Her happiness felt cold and out of place. Oh. Of course he hadn't chosen her. He turned to her.
Oh, no, Camilla, I didn't mean it like that. The one thing he was right about was that I am unstintingly lucky that it was you I was tied to. I went for a long walk afterwards. I didn't know what to think. I felt numb all over. The only thing that made it bearable was knowing that it was you. I promise you. The thought of you was like a ray of light amidst all the darkness. He hadn't chosen her. I'm not upset about you at all. It's about him. About my own expectations.
His voice shifted, higher, more quavering, as if he were imitating his uncle.
My dear boy, it's better than someone like you could have expected. I'm such a damned idiot.
It wasn't about her at all. This last hour when he'd brought her to bed. It hadn't been about her. She ought to have burst into tears at that. It hurt enough. But she'd cried too much today already. Camilla shrank back. She didn't want her mind to work, but it did. It was working all too well. He was not willing to assist you in obtaining an annulment. She should have asked outright, but she had been so happy that she hadn't questioned.
No, Grayson was right.
Adrian turned around.
And I'll have to tell him so. I've come to realize that I doubt my uncle actually thinks of me as a blood relationship. I'm a convenient tool, and his only surprise is that I expected him to care about me in return for the care I gave him. Tools shouldn't ask for a response.
She shouldn't focus on what this meant for herself. He'd just had his heart ripped out. He'd lost something enormous, and she knew she should comfort him. She had promised to make him happy after all. Nonetheless, the next quavering words out of her mouth were these. "You didn't choose me." She had thought, after how he'd held her, after what he'd said on the train, after everything that had just happened. Camilla was all too good at inventing encouragement. She'd done it often enough. She was sure that if she went through it all, she could find all the ways she had misstepped, the ways she had imagined appreciation where there was none. She had invented it all, a tale of love and forever out of lustful looks and a weeks-long friendship. She'd put her heart on her sleeve once again. She'd imagined that he would choose her, that he'd want her. She'd prepared to have her heart shredded. She hadn't prepared for this, to have it taken from her, treated with gentleness, and then burnt to a crisp in a blast furnace. Adrian turned to her. The harsh, unforgiving lines of his face melted.
"Oh, Cam."
He came to sit next to her. His arm went around her.
"I won't lie to you. No. I didn't choose you, but you have been everything to me these last weeks. I didn't choose you, but I do choose this. I choose to make the most of what we have."
Before she'd come to know Adrian, she would have accepted that. Second best was still a form of best after all. But she hadn't just wanted him to want her. She wanted everything he had painted in that idyllic picture weeks ago, when he'd told her why he wanted an annulment. She wanted a slow falling in love. She wanted a merging of friendship and adoration. She wanted a promise of mutual joy. She thought she had found it. He hadn't found any of that with her. She would always be his forced bride. She would always know that they were joined with a pistol and a deception first, and his uncle's betrayal second. She would never know what it was like to be chosen. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Adrian, I'm so sorry." She was. For both of them, she was sorry. He brushed his lips against her forehead.
"Don't be sorry,"
he said lightly.
"We'll make do. We're remarkably good at that."
Chapter 22. Camilla made herself retain her composure through the dinner and the bath that followed. She made herself laugh when he said something funny. She reminded him to contact his brother, and she nodded when he sighed and promised to do it in the morning. She made herself act as if her heart was still intact. He joined her in bed that night. She would have given him anything, but he just held her tightly, the clench of his muscles saying all the things he did not speak aloud. He hadn't chosen her. She felt the moment when he drifted off to sleep, his arm around her loosening. The lamps were out. She was in his arms. All she had to do was forget what she knew, forget what she wanted, and this could be her everything. He held her for comfort, and it was comforting. He was the farthest thing from a monster. Adrian had suffered a horrific blow delivered by a man who ought to have cared about his welfare. He'd brushed it off as best he could, but she knew what he had done for his uncle. He didn't deserve this. And yet, that also meant. It meant quite simply that he didn't deserve to be saddled with her, that he deserved the choice he wanted. Once, she might have thought that in sorrow, but with his arm around her, in the dark of the night, it felt like simple, rational truth. He'd wanted a choice. He'd wanted a slow falling in love. He'd wanted a family and joy. Instead, he'd found betrayal and tears. No matter how Camilla valued herself, she could not take that away. She would always be inextricably tied with his uncle's treachery. And she. Gently, she pulled his arm off her. She turned to face the wall. She hadn't said it to him. The fact that his uncle's betrayal hurt her, too, was not something he needed to grapple with at the moment, but it had wounded her deeply. He didn't deserve to be saddled with her, and she didn't deserve to be a saddle. She deserved to know that the man she spent the rest of her life with wanted her, valued her, believed in her. She deserved a choice, and a family, and joy, and a slow falling in love. If she did nothing, he wouldn't have that. Neither would she. She slipped out from under the covers. Her feet found the cold planks beneath. She'd always paced when she thought, and she did it now, hopping around the parts of the floor that squeaked under her passage so as not to wake him. One turn of the room, and her mind was boiling. She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve to spend the rest of her life wondering if he was regretting her at the moment. When they argued, and she was sure they'd find cause to disagree, as all people did, she deserved to know that he would strive to listen because he wanted her above all others, not because he needed to. She did not deserve to wonder if he was envisioning someone else, or if he mourned the woman he had not had the chance to choose. She didn't deserve a lifetime of not knowing. A second turn about the room. She watched his slumbering form, a dark lump under the blankets. One arm was poised over the empty shell of covers she'd left on the bed, as if he was still trying to comfort her, even in his sleep. Camilla gave her head a shake. She was being dreadfully unfair. Adrian wouldn't do that to her. He'd never let her know that he had doubts. He wasn't the sort to hold her worries over her head. But she would wonder. As much as she would tell herself not to, she would. She made a third circuit. There were worse things than a marriage where she wondered, were there not? He wouldn't beat her. They had a firm friendship and a physical rapport. She loved him, and she had no doubt he would deserve that love every day of her life. She had almost completed her 4th circle of the room, had almost convinced herself that she would grow used to this new reality. Her feet had warmed with her exertion. She loved him. Was that not enough? What did it matter when there was nothing to be done about it? It would be enough. It had to be. But deep inside her, Camilla had always had a dream. She had spent so long wanting someone to love her. She'd wanted to be chosen, to be wanted. She'd made bargains, walking back from the store in the snow. Please, if she will just love me, I'll never complain about anything again. She was no longer the woman who made desperate bargains for distant dreams. She didn't deserve to be loved a second place. She deserved to be loved without reservation or condition. She deserved more. He deserved more. And just because the thing she wanted was impossible, that didn't mean she needed to give up hope. She stopped walking. She stared straight ahead, thinking. They would have to get an annulment. They'd consummated the marriage, true, but she'd never been a virgin in the first place, and she'd read the reports. Others had lied about the matter. Why couldn't she? She wanted a choice. She imagined the world where she had that choice. In order to get there, she would have to obtain an annulment. An annulment in this circumstance meant power, and power meant... She had not thought of the letter from Teresa, not since Adrian returned. Judith missed her. Judith wanted her. Judith was married to a marquis and living in Mayfair. Maybe, once she'd heard the whole story, she'd reject Camilla as unfit. But even if Judith wanted nothing to do with Camilla, that too was useful. She could make a fuss until Judith gave in. Camilla exhaled. Camilla didn't need anyone to love her. She'd done without it long enough that she knew she could make do. Hope had given rise to certainty. Some day, some way, she would have it. Camilla needed someone powerful. She had someone powerful. She crept out of the room before she even quite knew what she was thinking, down the stairs, and found paper and a pen in an office on the ground floor. "My dear Adrian," she wrote, "I refuse to accept the outcome that we have been given. I refuse to accept that we have no choice. I am going to get our choice back by the means available to us. You can find me at my sister's if you wish. Your brother will have the direction. Your friendship has been the greatest gift that I could have known. I hope that even after we are separated, we are able to continue our acquaintance. If I had been given the chance to choose your friendship from the start, I would choose you again and again and again. I would choose everything about you, except the one thing I have been given, which is a you who did not choose me. Yours most truly, Cam." She couldn't find the blotting paper in the dark, not without upending the desk drawer and risking detection. Instead, she watched the extra ink bead, then dissipate into dark, spidery stains on her letter. She sat at the desk and watched the letter, making excuse after excuse why she should forget this all. She sat thinking until the clock struck 4 in the morning. There would be an early train to London. There was no more time to delay. She knew what she wanted. She just had to go get it before she lost her nerve. Camilla found her cloak on the hook in the wardrobe by the hall. She still had some coins left from the money he had once given her in her pocket. But now Now that she was pulling the fabric about her, now that she had written the letter, now she didn't want to leave. She wanted to stay here, to pretend that she'd never had the idea. She wanted to choose him in truth. She loved him. She didn't want to leave. Her eyes stung. But no. There were things she wanted more. Her chin went up. It was time to go, before he awoke, before she lost her nerve. She slipped out the front door, closing it gently behind her. The moment her feet touched the cold cobblestones, she realized her mistake. In her haste, she'd left her shoes behind. Or maybe, perhaps, she hadn't truly forgotten. Maybe she'd wanted to go back. Maybe she'd left them behind as a sign of cowardice, forcing herself to let go of a choice she knew she had to make. Camilla was not going to be a coward. Her chin went in the air, and she took another step forward. Thousands went without shoes every day. She could make do. Another step and another, and with every step the cold bit into the soles of her feet. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. She'd be in London by morning, and she didn't need shoes for what she was going to do. Chapter 23. The speed of modern transport meant that it was just past 7 in the morning, with the sun already beating down oppressively overhead, when Camilla arrived in London. The price of the ticket had taken most of her reserve funds. What remained was not enough to hire transportation of any stripe to the Mayfair direction given in Teresa's letter, or, for that matter, to purchase a pair of shoes. She'd walked only to the train station, and then off the train, not so far to go, even without shoes, she had thought, a mere half-mile. She'd walked 100 times that, with shoes that were falling apart. Her feet almost never got cold. How bad could it be? It turned out that even the least successful shoe was a vast improvement over pavement on bare skin. After quick consultation with 3 people, one of whom refused to speak to her, with a pointed sniff at her bare feet, and one of whom propositioned her rather than answer her questions, she finally was told how best to proceed to her sister's home. It was several miles more. Her bare feet didn't draw quite as much attention in the near vicinity of Paddington. Still, she made the acquaintance of every sharp stone between Paddington Station and Mayfair. None of it hurt as much as the deep, bruising ache in her heart. He hadn't chosen her. The further she went, the more her feet hurt, and the more people glanced down and then up, a sneer on their faces. She really didn't belong here. She wanted nothing more than to stop, to sit down, to give her soles the rest they screamed to have. But the houses around her grew nice, then comfortable, until finally they were downright imposing. There could be no stopping. She'd be told to leave the minute she looked like she didn't know where she was going. It took her hours to traverse the distance. By the time she arrived, she was half limping. Still, when she finally stood in front of the white stone building where Teresa had directed her, large and imposing, 4 stories high, flowers in the windows, she stopped and almost wished she could go back. Her heart was beating fast, so fast. What if Teresa had been wrong? What if it was a lie? Reality had played cruel tricks on her over the years. Her whole body ached with the cruelty of the last one. It was almost impossible to believe that this was not yet another cruel trick. What if they didn't want her? Her hand crept to her pocket. She checked the direction on the letter one last time, just to be sure. Hope was a choice. It had always been a choice. From the first moment she decided to hold on to it. It had been hope that pushed her from bed this last night, and hope that put one bare foot in front of the other all the way here. Camilla inhaled, made fists of her hands, and chose, foolishly, despite all possible evidence, to trust in it one more time. Her chin went up. She climbed the stone stairs to the entrance. The door did not open for her. Of course, she wasn't expected. On the other side, she could imagine a footman glaring at her barefoot form. She rapped the knocker and waited. No response came. She rapped again. Finally, the door opened an inch. The man who blocked that narrow gap glared down at her.
"The servants' entrance is round the back. If you have business, apply there."
Camilla straightened her spine. "I'm not a servant."
"Then shoo altogether."
She wouldn't start this way. She wouldn't act as if she were begging for scraps. Deep down inside her, she remembered the child she had once been, the one who might have been entitled to enter here. That girl had been disabused of most of her finer notions, but Camilla would do her best to remember.